anything we can do, we can afford to do. What Rachel Reeves is essentially saying, so imagine that she had the resources there, unemployed nurses and doctors and whatever, they're available who she could employ. Her fiscal rules would prevent her from doing that. She's really deliberately preventing herself. There's no actual reason operationally for doing that. And I think particularly the Labour Party, their relation to the city is one of fear. And also some of them have an eye in maybe getting a job there. And so it's this mixture of fear and admiration that, shall we say, the right of the Labour Party have got. And that's a huge problem for democratic government.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Dr. Phil Armstrong. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about recent events in the world of government budgeting, among other things. I just wanted to jump in here to let you know that Phil and Patricia and myself, we're all going to be at the Anti-austerity Conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September. The whole event can be attended online or in person. Other confirmed speakers include Stephanie Kelton via Zoom, and in person we've got the magnificent Stephen Hale, Zach Polanski from the Green Party, Mark Hooper from Plaid Cymru, Jeff Tilley, the senior economist for the TUC, Jaideep Pandit, who is a professor of anaesthesia at the University of Oxford, who did a great presentation at last year's MMT conference about NHS budgeting, and many more contributors. So look forward to seeing you there. Stephen Hale will also be teaching a workshop in Amsterdam on the 14th of September, a 2-day workshop in Sheffield on the 20th and 21st of September, and another 2-day workshop in Vienna on the 27th and 28th of September. I'll link to all of those things in the show notes, where, as ever, there'll be a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. This is part 2 of a 2-part conversation. The full-length interview is available now, along with many other patron-only episodes on our Patreon feed. Thanks, as ever, for your support and for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in.
So, look, having dealt with these like 2 pro-austerity talking points, namely that the government might run out of money, which is impossible, or that the private sector might stop lending the government money to spend, or foreigners might stop lending the government to spend. Again, that's not where the government gets its spending money from. The government is the source of its own spending money, right? So even all that said, people are still going to say 2 words in response to any proposed government spending they don't like. And those 2 words are Liz Truss, right? So I guess it's the same story about the path of inflation, or what bond traders think the path of inflation is going to be. But is there a quick response to the view that the Truss administration was fired by bond traders and that they'll do it again to any government proposing policies that they don't agree with?
Didn't the Bank of England make a ton of money out of this? Anyway.
I can imagine they did.
Yeah, they made billions out of it because they bought the bonds cheaply and then they sold them high. But also, everybody blames Liz Truss with her budget and this idea that, we couldn't afford what she was proposing. And I didn't like any of her policies, but I can imagine those arguments being used against somebody else. But nobody blames the response function of the central bank. As Phil just said, the only reason why bonds go up is because people are expecting higher interest rates because of inflation. But if the central bank doesn't have higher interest rates as a result of inflation, then that response function would not be there and the market would not have any reason to react in that way.
That was the way I wanted to cap this off, this segment, which is, how do we end the politics of the bond market made me do it?
Well, I think currently we have this idea that markets know better. So there's a view at the central bank, last time I spoke to anyone there, is They want to have a balance between the Bank of England setting interest rates, which it does when it sets the overnight rate. And they like the idea that markets should, because they know what they're doing, they should set the rest of the rates across the spectrum. And they do that by bidding. And it's this bidding that somehow disciplines government. So it's like giving them the gun because you think they ought to have it. Now, as long as that mentality is there that markets know best, it'll always be difficult for governments because they're deliberately, a bit like Rachel Reeves with the fiscal rules, she's deliberately tying her hand behind her back. Now, in that system, what they essentially have done and still have done is delegated that power to set the long-term interest rate on government bonds to bond markets as a policy choice. Now, the Liz Truss, like Patricia said, it was an expansionary budget. We wouldn't do the same thing. But essentially, they had these, if I remember the name of these, leverage financial investment funds, which were basically borrowing money to fund their slightly riskier investments. So the investments they were making...
LDI?
Yeah, they were LDIs, yeah. I noticed it was borrowing money. And so they were borrowing money and they were hoping to make profit on the borrowing money. So obviously the money they borrow is at a lower rate than the returns they were making. And this seems a good idea. But obviously when they were borrowing money, they had to hold government bonds as collateral. So the value of the bonds was crucial in the collateral from the people they'd borrowed the money from, hence the leverage element. Now, obviously, when Liz Truss, she's then obviously thinking, oh, great, we have an expansionary budget, and all the mechanisms that we've just said, the bond markets then think, oh, no, this expansionary budget is going to be inflationary, the Bank of England's putting interest rates. So the price of bonds went down, and that meant that the value of the collateral in these funds was lower. So consequently, they were all asked that they had to give money. But the only way they could do that by selling the bonds they had already, which made it worse. So they had to sell more bonds and made them even worth less. Now, at that point, you could say, why didn't the Bank of England immediately buy bonds to support the rate at the level it was? Why did it wait so long so that the price could fall and, as the producer said, make a profit by buying them cheaper? Should the National Bank be doing that? And I would say, okay, I don't like Liz Truss's policies, but again, like Patricia said, to me, it's central bank failure. The central bank should not have let that happen. Now, maybe I'm not privileged to the communication level between Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng and the central bank. Maybe they weren't informed in the right channels, so they were ready to go, because sometimes the Bank of England can be slow. I remember with Northern Rock, it was very slow in assuring people, and there was a run on the bank. So to me, that was a central bank failing, act strong enough, quick enough. And if you were political, maybe it's because Liz Truss wasn't popular in the Tory party or the financial sector, so they weren't that bothered about supporting her. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I know the majority of Tory MPs wanted Rishi. I'm sure the financial sector wanted Rishi. It was just the Conservative members that wanted Liz Truss. But we don't need that to happen. We should control bond markets. It's just that this is the price you can have, and that's it.
I'm going to quote this great person that I follow on Twitter called Patricia Pino. In response to, there was all this debt fear-mongering. This is a couple of weeks ago. And here it is, quote, "Stop issuing bonds. Interest rates drop to zero. Fiscal policy addresses inflation from now on. Problem fixed." End quote. I think that's a great idea.
To add nuance to that, you have to make alternative arrangements for potentially pensions and things like that. But yeah, why don't we just stop issuing bonds? One of the things that does worry me about this whole episode, and I can't say categorically that the Bank of England's decisions during the whole Liz Truss episode were political. I have my suspicions that they were, that at best, they probably just didn't like Liz Truss very much and were willfully slow to give her trouble. Like Phil was saying, they were slow. There was no reason for them to be that slow in their reactions. And at worst, it could be that they were actively working with people within her party that just didn't like her, like Rishi Sunak. I don't know. But all these, of course, this is speculation. Please, nobody tell me that I'm accusing anybody of anything. But it does worry me in that it blatantly means that there is an open opportunity there to be exploited by people who are not elected to basically undermine an elected government. And I understand that Liz Truss's government didn't have a particularly strong mandate, which contributed to the whole thing. But even if she had had it, it is perfectly possible for the central bank to be willfully slow or willfully neglectful on its duties to cause havoc and create this notion that it's the government creating the havoc as opposed to the central bank failing to meet its obligations just because they don't like a particular policy. And we know how chummy the Bank of England is with the City of London, how many ex-City of London employees end up in the Monetary Policy Committee. And I think there was the LIBOR scandal. They're always pretty tight. So it does worry me that it opens yet another avenue for undemocratic undermining of government policy.
Yeah. And also just wanted to chip in again from this tweeter that I think you should really follow it. Patricia Pino is the name. I think it's at Patricia and Pino. Quote, the lesson from recent years should be global shocks happen unexpectedly. Therefore, you can't set strict fiscal rules because you may be obliged to break them to keep the country stable and your electoral base happy. Ditch them. That's it. End quote. Again, yeah, I agree. Even the Institute for Fiscal Studies said this week that there was a strong case for Rachel Reeves to tweak her self-imposed fiscal rules. So, do you know what I mean? That's even the IFS, for God's sake.
If you go back to your point, Christian, at the beginning, anything we can do, we can afford to do. What Rachel Reeves is essentially saying, for no reason whatsoever, other than, well, we can come to why she's got the fiscal rules later, but there's no actual reason operationally for doing that. She's really deliberately preventing herself from doing that. So imagine that she had the resources there, unemployed nurses and doctors and whatever, they're available who she could employ. Her fiscal rules would prevent her from doing that. So it goes exactly against what Keynes was saying. If we've got the resources, we should be using them. And I think the reason that I don't know the answer again, the politics. I think particularly the Labour Party, their relation to the city is one of fear, but also deep respect and admiration. They're frightened of the city is full of very clever financial people who've got a lot of control over things, and they kind of try and butter them up. And also some of them have an eye in maybe getting a job there. And so it's this mixture of fear and admiration that, shall we say, the right of the Labour Party, that certainly the Starmer right wing have got. And that's a huge problem for democratic government because they have ceded way too much power to the city and they're frightened of the city. There's no question of that. And they're a bit overawed by the qualifications and the history of the city. And obviously someone who's much better at sociology and institutions than I am would be able to analyse why exactly this is the case. But it is a real threat to democracy, this. Whereas the Tories obviously admire the city, but I think because they are close to them, they don't have quite the same fear of the city that the Labour Party have. And that's my perception from the limited amount of political figures I've talked to.
So while we're talking about the city, I wanted to bring currency prices into this. So in terms of the exchange rate between the pound and other currencies, the pound went down against the dollar when Rachel Reeves was sad. It went down against the dollar and the euro when we voted to leave the EU. It went down sharply when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng presented their mini budget. But the story is, if our currency weakens against the currencies of our trading partners, imports become more expensive, we'll get imported inflation. So far, we don't need a wheelbarrow full of cash to go shopping with. But, you know, it's always just about to happen, according to many in the blogosphere, including those who are, I'm sure, entirely coincidentally trying to get their audience to buy gold or Bitcoin. But anyway, should we worry about the foreign exchange market's potential reaction to any given policy? Do currency traders have any veto power over our government's policies?
No. I mean, what's interesting about all that is that if you selling pounds speculatively. It's a very complicated market, and there's all these deals at various points that have to be closed out. And I'm not an expert in foreign exchange market dealing, but essentially, if you're selling currency, you want to sell high and buy back cheap. So if you're holding pounds, if you think, well, I think that everybody else is going to think that the price is going to go down, you're going to sell it, but then you're going to buy it back. So what tended to happen with these episodes like the Liz Truss episode and other things, the pound goes down and then it goes back up again. Maybe not to exactly the same level it was before. And this idea that the price of imports will be very much higher, the pass-through from the exchange rate to prices, it does exist. And I know maybe Patricia can analyse this in some of the modelling structures at UCL, but the pass-through is much lower than people suggest it is because there's so many other factors that go into prices. They can't keep swapping prices or into short-term fluctuations in the exchange rate. Firms just don't operate in that way. So it's possible. But a currency like the pound, it's a well-traded currency and people are buying and selling it all the time. It goes up and down, fine. And the other thing I think is very, very interesting about the exchange rate thing, people suggest, don't they, when the pound goes down, oh, it's a terrible thing. But at the same time, they say, well, China's a terrible country. Why? Well, they keep pushing their currency down. Well, how does that work then? So China's deliberately making their currency lower, and that's bad. They should be keeping it high. So the implication is it's a terrible thing. So if China deliberately doing it, why are they moaning if they're deliberately doing something bad to themselves? It doesn't make sense. So the answer, of course, is when the exchange rate falls, it's purely distributional. If you're an exporter, then your price to foreigners is lower. So you're going to sell more and you'll earn more domestic currency then. And then if you're an importer, then it's a reverse effect. So it's a distributional effect. And Warren talks about this a lot. In your nation, a lower exchange rate is good for exporters and bad for importers. And that's purely what it is. And it's all people panicking.
It used to be that exchange rates were entirely set by, or were closely mirrored the trade imbalances between countries, and therefore they were a reflection of trade. But that's long gone. The trade transactions in currency are minuscule compared to the speculative transactions. And so the speculation dominates exchange rate markets. John T. Harvey is really good at this. But basically, the exchange rate is affected by anything that speculators think it's affected. So it's extremely volatile as a result of it. But also with the exchange rate pass-through, very often I get surprised with how many economists in the UK even, or just generally people do believe that because the UK imports a large quantity of food or imports a lot of energy, that necessarily that translates into a high exchange rate pass-through inflation, which would be what would happen in a developing economy, right? And we usually talk about a developing economy being highly dependent on goods from abroad. Well, they say, well, we're importing a lot of energy, hence we must be like a developing economy. And it's definitely not like that. I mean, empirically, not even the Bank of England fully understands why the exchange rate pass-through is so low in the UK. So for sure, that's not entirely understood by anybody. But the truth is that it's extremely low, and it's extremely low for the UK, it's extremely low for the US, it's extremely low for developed economies in general. And I think a lot of the reason is it's not just about the quantity of the things that we import, but it's also the nature of the things we import, but also the nature of the things we export by itself. We export a lot of things that for which there isn't many sources for in the UK. You know, our financial services, what was our main competitor is probably Wall Street. That's it. We export a lot of things that is not easy for people who buy those exports to simply replace, or not as easy. Whereas maybe if you're exporting, say, wheat, you may have a few alternative sources from which to obtain that wheat. For the things that the UK exports, there aren't that many sources of it, which means, I think, if I'm looking at it through the prism of pricing, it means that we have a relatively high pricing leverage, right? We have a lot more power to price our products abroad in the way that we want them to be priced, whereas the people who sell things to us don't have as much power to do that. So they're more likely to absorb exchange rate fluctuations and all this stuff than we are. And I suspect, I have not done a paper on this, so I have no proof for what I'm saying, but I suspect that has a lot to do with the reason why exchange rate pass-through doesn't behave in the way that we think it might do.
Okay, right. So while we're in this area, and apologies, this is a big setup, but I think it needs unpacking a little bit. So I'm going to just go into it. So get strap in. Okay. There's this thing called Thirwall's law. So now you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but in a nutshell, it says that nations should have balanced trade, i.e. they should only import as much as they're able to export. And if a nation attempts to increase its growth rate beyond a certain level, for instance, by using domestic full employment policies like we like, that will lead to the nation's imports becoming greater than its exports. That produces a current account deficit. And a current account deficit means foreigners are lending their savings to the deficit nation. And as they lose confidence in the ability of the debtor nation to make repayments, because they see the current account deficit is rising, these foreign lenders then demand ever higher interest rates. Also, the rating agencies take a dim view. They downgrade the nation's credit rating. That drives up interest rates further. The currency weakens. That leads to imported inflation and more likely hyperinflation. And so just to recap, the idea is that even for a government that issues its own currency, there's a certain rate of growth in a nation's economy, and moving beyond this rate of growth results in that nation having to pay unsustainably high levels of interest to foreign lenders and high levels of domestic inflation and ultimately a currency collapse. Now, this growth rate beyond which a nation mustn't go is referred to as the balance of payments constraint, if I'm reading it right. And it's largely dependent on the nation's capacity to export. So if it net exports more, it can grow faster without hitting the constraint. Now, all of this gets used by economists to argue that governments should pursue export-led growth strategies to tackle unemployment rather than direct job creation. So thanks for following me on that journey. What's our response to all of that? I'm sorry that there was a lot there, but it's quite a journey and you have to go on it to understand why economists think like this.
I mean, everybody can't export. We're not exporting to Mars. I mean, so it's one of these fallacies of composition. And also I haven't read it for years. I do remember it. I've got a book on it, like dusty old one, I think. But it's something that might apply under a fixed exchange rate system. If you're exporting a lot less than you're importing, then that's going to put downward pressure on your exchange rate, and you're in a fixed exchange rate peg. So you're going to have to borrow dollars to support your rate, and there might be conditionality and there might be other problems. But it's got no relevance whatsoever on a floating exchange rate system because they have it the wrong way around. If you're running a current account deficit, that's because foreigners have a net savings desire for your currency. So you can only run a current account deficit if foreigners have got a net savings desire for your currency. So if you're in a fortunate position that other countries want to hold your currency, then you can import more than you export and you can grow faster. So there is no problem. Now, obviously, the downside comes as if foreigners don't want, they have no net savings desire for your own currency. Then you are in trouble in the sense that you've got to export enough to import the stuff you need. And that's problematical, particularly for developing countries, because then they might think, well, okay, we can't export enough to get the dollars we need for vital imports of foods and medicines. So we need to borrow from the IMF or something, and they'll do bad things. So that is a possibility. But Thirwall's law that there's a balance of payments constraint on current account deficits is a fixed exchange rate phenomenon. And this is one of the problems that a lot of the things that economists say, a bit like the bond thing, if you're on a fixed exchange rate or a gold standard, then, you know, if you did have a very large deficit, then you might have to offer a very high interest rate to prevent people swapping your convertible currency into gold. So big government deficits might drive the interest rate up. But it doesn't apply under a floating rate. As we said, you can set the rate whatever you want. So under floating rate, you can just let the exchange rate take the strain. There is no balance of payments constraint in that sense, anything to do with growth. And obviously, you are in a really good position if foreign countries haven't a net savings design in your currency, like the United States, because as the United States was importing huge amounts of stuff from China and was therefore winning. As always said, all this real stuff was coming into America and the Americans were benefiting from that. Obviously, the Americans got a lot of free labor and they didn't realize that they could employ that labor to, going back to Keynes, pursue public purpose. So you had unemployment. But Trump obviously has got it the wrong way around. So he's kind of killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So I think the problem with Thirwall is it doesn't understand the nature of current account deficit. The nature of current account deficit is because foreigners want to net save your currency. If they don't, then you can't have it.
I also, as you say, Phil, that applies to fixed exchange rates or I guess gold standard stuff as well. But it also applies to a context, as I said before, where exchange rates respond to trade, right? If you have a speculation being 99% of cross-border transactions, then fixed exchange rates are a bad idea in that context to begin with, just altogether. And B, it makes it even more irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bigger question, but you have to really ask yourself is, why do we have all this speculation of currencies? Is it serving public purpose? And my answer would be no, but then that would be a political thing. Should we restrict speculation? And I don't mean, sometimes people say I'm doing it in order to fix exchange rates. I'm not doing that. I think exchanges can go where they want to go. But obviously, speculation does make them more volatile. It does allow people who are not serving public purpose, all they're really doing is making life difficult for everybody else by money going up and down. What public purpose is the serving? None. So for me, I would put a lot of restrictions on speculation. And I don't mean legitimate hedging of currencies in foreign currencies, so you're offsetting the possibility of a currency movement when you're involved in export. But just pure borrowing loads of pounds to sell, to buy back later, all this sort of stuff. I can't really see how that's productive. Now, obviously, going back, the city makes an awful lot of money out of banks doing all this sort of activity. So really, that's probably the reason why a country like Britain wouldn't really do that, because you're really preventing the city from making as much money as it does now. It's not that it's particularly difficult to do it in an operational sense, but it would be difficult politically to do it. But as you were saying, with the vast amount of currency speculation going on, I think it was Keynes, I can't remember the exact quote, do another one about it's speculators may do no harm as bubbles on a steady stream of enterprise, but the position is serious when enterprise becomes the bubble on a whirlpool of speculation. It is longer than that, but I think when the capital development of a country becomes a byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
So turning the corner at the upcoming Anti-austerity Conference, 12th to the 13th of September in Bristol, but also online, Phil and Patricia, you are going to be co-presenting a short presentation billed as an introduction to employment, and you're going to be on a discussion panel that follows that presentation. So I just wanted to spend a bit of time linking the money mechanics that we've been talking about so far to the government's approach to employment, or more accurately, the lack of any approach. Phil, I'll start with you. How would you say MMT links to the issue of employment?
I think it links to the end ontology stuff that, as we talked about the money thing, that initially the government's aim is to provision itself. So it levies a tax liability, and then people must offer goods and services, in particular labour, to the government to earn the currency to pay their taxes and to net save. So from inception, tax liabilities cause unemployment. So that if you the fundamental cause of unemployment is the levying of a tax. And therefore, if you've got unemployment, it means that the tax rates must be too high. In other words, you're creating more resources being freed up for the government than it's actually buying. So once you have that understanding, you realise that if the government is causing unemployment by the levying of a tax, it would be pointless not to employ people. It's like me saying, right, okay, like with the old hut tax. Right, Christian, you're working on the fields out when you come work for me. And what I'll do is, if you work for me, I'll give you some money. So therefore, you can earn the tax and I won't burn your hut down. So you think, oh, I don't really fancy it, but I'll do it anyway. So you come to me and I go to you, no, there's no jobs for you. And you go, well, you just put a tax on me. Well, sorry, hard luck. So it's insane to put a tax in the population to free up resources and not use them, which is why the government obviously should decide, and this is the resource planning, how many workers it needs to fully provision the public sector, and then it levies a tax at a rate to free those resources up, and then it leaves less of those resources for the private sector to employ. But if the private sector don't do that, then it needs a job guarantee, which is the transition job for those workers who then will be able to access the state income to pay the taxes and net save, because those resources will be idle otherwise. And then that obviously feeds onto the job guarantee, which is Patricia's subject really in the presentation.
So arguably mainstream economists, even the ones that advise the progressive think tanks, and especially the not so progressive think tanks and governments, these economists think that people working for money, otherwise known as employment, is just something that happens in nature, and employment will peak when the government does everything it can to get out of the way and facilitate the naturally occurring, infinitely wise and mysterious market to act without intervention. Whereas we say, and Phil ran through it just then, we say money and markets where people sell things for money, including their time and labor, are the results of government intervention in the first place. And I think relative newcomers to MMT can sometimes get the impression that the MMT job guarantee is just a policy suggestion. It's a nice thing to have, but it's optional. So, Patricia, I think you and I would say, no, the job guarantee is actually central to MMT. You'd agree with that, right?
Yeah, I think to starters, that idea that the economy kind of adjusts towards full employment naturally, it stems from a belief in a free market, but also stems from a belief that prices adjust in the economy so that all markets clear, including the labor market, right? And at the moment, we have the paradigm will accept that is true in the long term. So the economy is always tending towards full employment, but accepts that in the short run, there may be some price stickiness or wage stickiness so that prices are not allowed to adjust as they should in order to achieve full employment. And that has allowed some room for monetary policy to happen and all this. Of course, that is also wrong. We know that employment is a function of aggregate demand, and aggregate demand is a function of, amongst other things, primarily income and government spending, right? And in that context, the job guarantee, it fulfills very many roles. One of them is, of course, a moral aspect of it, which is that any unemployment is a sign of insufficient deficits or insufficient spending, so that they should be eliminated. And the job guarantee does that. But the other one is that it's a superior automatic stabilizer in the economy. And that means that it's able to automatically adjust government spending to ensure that there are no wasted resources. And with that, you're able to stabilize prices much more effectively in both the short and the long run, right? That doesn't mean that there is no price shocks, especially supplies price shocks. That will always happen unexpectedly, but it does mean that you have a much better stable base on which to starting point. And then you can deal with those supply shocks in a discretionary manner, perhaps. So you need that. So the job guarantee is fundamental, I believe, to MMT's inflation management approach, which of course sidelines monetary policy in favor of fiscal policy. And some of those fiscal policy measures for ensuring price stability will be discretionary, so we'll be investing in key industries and all this stuff. But others are really just about buffer stocks, and the most important buffer stock is that of labor.
The way I like to think about it is, and you have to stay tuned until the end of the sentence or the end of the paragraph as well, because this is one of these things where people jump in and kind of go, people don't like the connotations when you start off. But the way I like to think about it is that the government is the source of unemployment. Like when it lays on its tax, it creates unemployment. But then it's also the cure for the unemployment. When it hires people and supplies the private sector with the money that it needs to pay its tax liability and to net save. So it unemploys people, but only for the further purpose of hiring all the people it caused to be unemployed. It's not the plan to leave people behind. Like Warren Mosler would say, full employment is the base case for analysis of the monetary system. The government imposes a tax on the private sector. It creates unemployment, but only for the further purpose of hiring all the unemployed people it created with the tax. If it doesn't do that, it's not using the system as intended. So the base case is everyone gets a job. If you want to deviate from the base case and leave some residual unemployment in the system for some reason, like we do now in most so-called advanced economies, it's on you as the advocate of this government-imposed unemployment to make a rational case for it. And what people with half a grasp of mainstream economics will say is unemployment keeps inflation down. And you kind of touched on this just then, Patricia. So they're like, as much as we hate it, it's necessary. We need an independent central bank to come in and declare that unemployment is too low at the moment. We need to raise it. And, what's our answer to that idea that true full employment will lead to inflation or could lead to inflation?
Well, that's the Phillips curve, isn't it? That basically drew a relationship between employment levels, and it was initially, I think it was wage prices, so wages. So implying, I think that the implication was that the higher the employment rates, the stronger the wage bargaining power of workers, and therefore the more likelihood that you get into kind of these wage price spirals, and then you risk higher inflation as a result of that. The issue is, of course, that now we don't have that. And it may have been that at the time, the context in which the Phillips curve came about may have mattered. Back then, there was much stronger unions. It was just a much more beneficial environment for workers in general. Whereas now, I don't think there is any chance of a wage price spiral.
But also with the job guarantee, we're talking about a buffer stock of employed people. At the moment, we have a buffer stock of unemployed people disciplining wage demands, I guess you could say, right? The idea is that the people working in the job guarantee, when the economy picks up and it's on the upswing, people are going to be hired out of that pool of employed buffer stock, employed labor. That's only going to lead to an inflationary spiral if the government or the job guarantee scheme then goes, oh, no, we want them back in the job guarantee. Let's offer a higher wage for the job guarantee. And the private sector goes, we want this worker, and back and forth. And that, I think sometimes people miss that like, no, it's fixed. The ideal outcome is we want this buffer stock of employed people that are in the job guarantee. We want that to be as small as possible, actually, right?
Yeah, so Warren calls what you mentioned earlier about the government creating unemployment and therefore it needs to eliminate unemployment. And that if it doesn't do so, I think Warren calls it an error.
Yeah.
Which I think is very kind of him. But they're basically trying to make labor cheap for the private sector to pick up. And by making labor cheap, they see it as the more employment you create or the more precarious the employment opportunities you create, then the easier it is for the private sector to scoop up workers without having to pay them much, right? And I think that's what they're trying to facilitate. I don't know who they is, but I think that whatever combined establishment we have, I think that the end result is that we have a system that actually facilitates exploitation by the private sector. And we don't have to have that. We could have, with the job guarantee, a system where you guarantee everybody employment. Actually, you're making it easier for workers to say no to exploitative working conditions, right? That's what you're doing. You're giving all your workers the option to say no to private sector exploitative work practices. And of course, that is going to be pushed back with a vengeance, but that's what we need to fight for.
Yes. Essentially, the job guarantee, instead of workers competing for jobs, you're making employers compete for workers. Now, that is a very interesting turnaround.
It's transformational.
And if you think about that, the guys that were getting more applicants before, so they could obviously pay them poorer wages, manage them badly, etc., because there's a big queue. Now it's more difficult for them because there's a big queue of employers now. So essentially, because they've always got the option of the job guarantee, and that, to me, that floor to pay and conditions has a huge effect on the whole structure of employment above that. And I think that's what makes it great. It does give people choice. Because all these Austrian schools, they're all talking about choice. It's a wonderful thing. In a case where a lot of people haven't got any choice.
Unless workers have it, yeah.
Because you either work for rubbish wages or you starve, because in their world there's no welfare state, of course. So that's not much of a choice, really. So they're going about choice, but there's no choice at all. This time, a job guarantee actually does provide a worker with a choice, because they can choose a private sector firm if it's decent wages, decent conditions, and better than the job guarantee living wage. Fine. But if it's not, then tough luck. And I think there's been too much mollycoddling of business. And in a sense with that, what you do is it doesn't help that, so apparently workers have to work hard, learn all this, train this, do that. But employers get an easy ride. They can have anyone they want. So I'm caricaturing a bit, but it's time to turn the tables in the sense that, yes, it's great private sector to employ people in Britain. But there are rules that you have to follow to do that. And I think that's the way to go, definitely.
Can I add one bit to this? Because I think it's quite important. In the UK, the left, given that there's all these kind of new parties coming around now, and the left is mobilizing. The left has always been against precarious working conditions. They're against, what do they call it, the 0 hours contracts. And there's always something coming up, right? There's always a new innovation in the labor market of how to exploit workers and make it look like you're doing them a favor. And the left is always trying to kind of ban these practices, which is, we have to get rid of them. That is, the aim is right, but the approach is perhaps not the right one.
Well, it's kind of a whack-a-mole sort of.
Exactly.
Yeah, rather than let's just root and branch.
Exactly. And in a nutshell is that while there are desperate workers looking for work, there will always be a creative way to get them exploited and then make them feel grateful for it. That is it in a nutshell. So the only way to eliminate all these bad working practices is to give them that choice out of it, give them a better alternative.
if you're in charge of economic policy and you don't think about money through the MMT lens, like we've said, the government unemploys people via taxes for the further purpose of creating full employment. Why wouldn't you do that? If you're in charge of economic policy and you don't think about money through the MMT lens, you're always going to have to get growth, quote unquote, growth to pay for things, right? And then sure enough, a couple of weeks ago, the Chancellor gives her Mansion House speech, and she tells the audience that regulation is the boot on the neck of business. So government needs to tighten its belt because there's no money, because of my facial expression a few weeks ago, right? So now we've got to slash regulation on the financial sector. Oh, and also educate, quote unquote, the public into taking bigger risks with their savings. I mean, I can't see any problem with that plan. Can you?
It's all like insane, really.
If we learned anything from 2008 is that we need to risk more. More Bitcoin, maybe add Bitcoin to the mix. I don't know.
It's interesting when you've got a currency issuer who's then having to rely, like, it's like me, I suppose, in my old teaching days, saying, well, look, I'm too short of the old analogy. I can't mark your present. So what we have to going to do is take a load of risks and try and go and borrow the present marks from other teachers, because we haven't been risky enough in trying to do it. So we can't just go and knock on their classrooms like we used to and ask them for present marks. We've got to throw ropes out of the windows and try and go down toward the floors to borrow the present marks from the other teachers. Then not only would the kids think that you were a lunatic, they'd also think you're a very dangerous lunatic. That's what she's really doing. She said, look, I know I've got unlimited spending power, but we haven't got any money. So we're going to have to get it off you guys, and you're going to have to take more risks in doing it. I mean, and by the way, we've deliberately tied our hand behind our back, both of them. We've got stupid fiscal rules. There's no point at all. I forgot we're not under the gold standard. And I might go and cry, and that make things even worse. And that's more or less where we are. I mean, hopefully things are going to get better. The old Blair song, maybe this time with Jez and Zara, we might get somewhere. We'll hope for the best.
Well, I always think the good news is it is possible to turn this around. But, you know, the thing that's holding us back is the way we think about money. So before we wrap up, I think for people who understand all this stuff we've been talking about so far, namely that the government can't run out of money, and therefore austerity and all the suffering and deprivation and social harm that austerity produces, that's completely unnecessary. I think for people who understand all of that, and they've maybe been on a bit of a journey with us for a few months or a few years, they've been out there trying to make what we're saying common sense in their peer groups, in their families, at work. I think there's a danger of getting burnt out, becoming cynical. So for people who are like that, and if you're listening and you are like that, I feel your pain. Phil, I'll ask you first, what gives you hope? What gives you the energy to keep going?
Well, I think it's the knowledge that things can change. Like everything was a certain way and then it wasn't. So it's like the Berlin Wall falling. It can happen. We did get a Labour government in 1945 that transformed things. We did, and even smaller, we did get a minimum wage. We did get women's suffrage. So things can happen, and it is difficult. So I think there will become more crises, because the level of competence amongst governments, and it's not a conspiracy theory, they really don't know. So let's get that. I always say that, oh, well, they understand. Don't give them too much credit. And that's good. They aren't that clever, these people. So when an opportunity comes in a crisis, we have to be ready to grasp it. And our message is simple. Keynes was right. From a government's point of view, whatever we can do, we can afford. And we get glimpses of that. We got a glimpse of it in the war. We got a glimpse of it when we saw what happened in the COVID crisis, when the stuff was spent when it had to be. So we do see glimpses of what can be done. Then the curtain's drawn. We just have to, next time the curtain's drawn a bit open, we have to stop being pulled shut. And we can do it. We've got the right method and we understand the system. So be bold.
So I'll tell you what makes me feel hopeful. During Stephen Hale's really great event in London, I went to on the Sunday, quite a few people approached me on the day, and I really wasn't expecting this. Quite a few people, quite young faces, new faces I hadn't seen before, who had taken Stephen Hale's course, who were taking it. And they approached me wishing to thank me and you, Christian, saying that they had gotten into Stephen Hale's course because of the podcast. And that feels incredible for me to know that we have achieved just even to inspire however small group of people into taking such big action. It feels really good. And it feels that this is all worthwhile. Whatever pains we've gone through, whatever frustration we've been through in the last 10 years or more even, that it's moments that make it all worthwhile. So thank you guys. But apart from that, I do think the political landscape is changing in a positive way. And you don't have to necessarily like Jeremy Corbyn and his politics to be at the very least pleased that there is far more representation in British politics now than there has ever been in terms of the full spectrum. And I think that we are generally much stronger and wiser perhaps than we were in 2016. And that we are really kind of starting to hone down on what the actual problems are. I think perhaps before we were just a bit too scattered or kind of still trying to figure out exactly what is going on, right? Whereas I think now I feel like the left is matured a lot more. Fingers crossed it has. But I think there's a lot to get stuck on, get involved in and make things happen. And there's all this energy and I think it's great. So I'm feeling much better than I have been for a while. And I really hope that everybody does as well.
Oh, that's great to know. All right, I'm going to add a quote that I quite like. And this is from Donella Meadows, an environmental scientist who we talked about with our previous guest, Katie Shields. Here's the quote. Quote, so how do you change paradigms? In a nutshell, you keep pointing at the anomalies and failures in the old paradigm. You keep speaking louder and with assurance from the new one. You insert people with the new paradigm in places of public visibility and power. You don't waste time with reactionaries. Rather, you work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. So keep speaking up, people. That's where we'll leave it. We've been speaking to Dr. Phil Armstrong, and as we've been talking about, Phil and Patricia and me, we're all going to be at the Anti-austerity Conference in Bristol on the 12th and 13th of September. The whole event can be attended online or in person. Other confirmed speakers include Stephanie Kelton via Zoom, and in person, we've got the magnificent Stephen Hale, as we've been talking about, Zach Polanski from the Green Party, Mark Hooper from Plaid Cymru, Jeff Tilley, the senior economist for the TUC, Jaideep Pandit, who is a professor of anesthesia at the University of Oxford, who did a great presentation at last year's MMT conference about NHS budgeting. Many more contributors, so look forward to seeing you there. Stephen Hale will also be teaching a workshop in Amsterdam on the 14th of September, a 2-day workshop in Sheffield on the 20th and 21st of September, and another 2-day workshop in Vienna on the 27th and 28th of September. If you want to take your understanding of MMT and real-world economics to the next level, Modern Money Lab run online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the best lecturers in the world in their respective fields, including Dr. Phil Armstrong. So I'll link to more about all of the above in the show notes, where, as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Phil Armstrong.
It's been a pleasure as always.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.